I was originally described to my husband, Cosimo de' Medici, as beautiful, fresh, with a rosy complexion, with a graceful gait, a reverential stance, a sweet voice, full of intelligence, a clear face, an angelic gaze. Cosimo sought my health and my happiness as much as...
I was just going to say that in my long and distinguished career of watching atmospheric and evocative performances, that's really got to take the cake. I think we got everything really, didn't we? The combination of the architecture and the steam coming out of the baths and the rain coming down and the bells. It's really absolutely everything. And I think there's a fabulous theatrical magic about the whole thing from start to finish. And I'd just like to thank you and Chris White and Nick Sorensen, for really drawing that out of a space which I guess particularly for local people you possibly know extremely well and won't have quite ever seen in that context. And I think that's one of the things that great site-specific theatre does, is that it helps you look at a space anew, to see its possibilities in a different way. And I think I'm certainly very grateful. In fact, as it happens, I visited Bath just in January and went through this, and it's a stunning ensemble. But to see it put to the use of theatrical performance was really, really rather stunning. And I'm really grateful to you for the experience. It's not one that any of us are going to forget anytime soon. I'm absolutely confident about that. I guess probably the thing I would like to start by asking you really is not something that I thought of previously, but there's a real aspect within this of a kind of, without wanting to sound too corny about it, there's something to do with women's lives and how they're expressed. And it did seem to me to be a beautifully, there's the use of needlework at a certain point, and it did rather occur to me that there was something about that terribly close attention to detail that seemed to be all the way through this character, all the way through this 450-year-old woman that we're being introduced to tonight. Would you like to say anything about that while I adjust this microphone?
Thanks very much, Greg, for everything you've said so far, and thank you to all the audience as well for being there. It's the vital part of the engagement. Yes, I think that the detail is there, because obviously if you take the needlework, it's a fact that she had not just many people in her employment who spent their whole time weaving with all these incredible silks and so on, but there was a whole hierarchy of who was the top weaver of all Florence. And if you think about the dress that she wears for Bronzino's portrait, I think it's something like there were 3 craftsmen that were possible in the whole of the country to, do the weaving. I don't know if that relates at all to Kate Middleton and what happened there. But I think that perhaps for her, that detail becomes a way to express herself through that love of fabrics and what kinds of outfits she can have, and also to create some new outfits. She was one of the first women to actually have what was a kind of hunting gown that was really quite simple but very practical, because she grew up loving hunting, from childhood.
I guess that comes to probably the most famous image that many people in this room will have seen. It's, after all, with a sort of type of audience that probably has been to Florence and has seen the Bronzino portrait at the Uffizi. If you haven't, it's well worth visiting. It's absolutely fantastic. It's an extraordinary portrait, partly because, Bronzino's art is one where he's always seeking to reconcile the requirements of a portrait painter, that is, it should be flattering, with seeking the other story, with seeking something beyond the initial appearances. And there's something really rather radiant about that portrait. And there's also something again, you've talked about the fabrics. None of that is insignificant. And I think that's one of the things that, when watching it this evening, I was so aware of the attention to detail through the whole thing. Now, I'm just wondering, and I guess this is the academic in me, I can't help it, I've got to ask a sort of academic question about then the approach to what we academics in this area might refer to as the scenography, the writing of the scene. What is it that, I guess when you're approaching a subject like this, it becomes quite easy, let's pull out all the biographical details and let's sort of start a nice narrative and we'll all get it lined up in a straight line. I've got the impression that's not what's happened here.
No, it isn't at all, Greg. Really, the sources for the start of the piece was that portrait, by Bronzino. But I did look at a lot of portraits that he did, and a lot of portraits of Eleonora. And I became quite interested in how she is presented, which, of course, is the style for many people that follow, like Francesco I, for example, who, interestingly, when they digged up his remains, they found that he had a club foot, which no one had realized that before, and all sorts of other conditions. But in the portraits, of course, he always looks absolutely perfect, as men do. And
as men are, you mean?
Really, when I actually...
Well, she looks rather perfect, though. I mean,
yeah, she does. She does, absolutely.
You know, Bronzino's not... You know, Bronzino's customers certainly got their shot at posterity.
Yeah, yeah. Those portraits were one aspect, but what I was going to say was this was actually conceived originally as an art installation, and the proposal that I put in was very much more contemporary. It was nothing to do with Eleonora de Toledo at all, and it was looking at Florentine citizens' contemporary style, asking them to bring in fashion mementos, articles of clothing, or something that was very personal to them, that related to a story about their health and well-being. A juried panel chose it, and the thrill for me about this was that if you were lucky enough to be commissioned for it, you would get to perform or make it in one of the great heritage sites of Florence. And so when I learnt the news, they then said to me, we wondered if you'd like to do it in the Palazzo Vecchio, and perhaps in Eleonora de Toledo's apartments.
Phew.
But I didn't even know who Eleonora de Toledo was, you see. And
it's often how projects begin, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, absolutely. Yeah. And I went to look at it and so on. And they also offered the orangery at the Palazzo Pitti, you know, outside. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then the director of the whole event said, what, you don't know Eleonora? And you really, Alison, you should, you know. And that was the beginning of me starting to read about her and find out about her. And then I became completely hooked in everything, you know, and as you know, I was researching so many different things and getting really excited about just discovery about this woman, because obviously on the front of everything is always that she gave birth to 11 children, and the depths of variety of things that she was passionate about. She was patron of the arts. She did so much for fashion at the time, and of course in the 16th century trade and textiles were just huge at the time. And she comes across as quite a mixed picture, but I mean, you know, that's typical of a complexity of a human being, I think, and I just really became, you know, excited about what the possibilities of her were. And at the same time, I suppose, as that, I then, at some point in the research, discovered the actual garments, which are in the Palazzo Pitti in the Galleria del Costume. And that was a 12-year construction project where I interviewed the director of the Palazzo Pitti there, and she led the project, and she just told me these amazing stories about how this box with these garments had been found, and they were going to, I don't think they were going to throw them away, but they weren't really thinking what could be done, and she said they have to be conserved, and that was the beginning of the project. And actually going to see them in the Galleria they're in these special air-conditioned cabinets, really made it come alive. And that was another factor, because obviously, as you know, when you're devising something, creating a piece, there's never just one thing. There's so many things threading their way in and all contributing to sort of, in the end, what kind of direction you might go in.
So does that mean, when you're sort of there, in relation to work like this, does that mean that when you're trying to put it together, I guess it's this kind of mixture of forces that are really working simultaneously? This is not, if you like, it's the narrative becomes sort of irrelevant at this point anyway, and that you're just trying to balance up all these forces of the various things that you're discovering about the combination of character and the way that person might be representative of something as well. I think we all sort of got that. And again, the atmosphere, the sort of locus, the sort of habitus of that person. That's quite a complex thing when you just think about yourself. Is that? How did you? Am I sort of suggesting a method that you might have used, or was it something completely different?
No, I don't think it's a method. Definitely not.
Fair enough.
I don't think. No, absolutely not a method. I think that you get to sort of points in the journey of where you think you're going, and then something turns up. It's always like that, a bit like life. And for me, the turning point was the discovery of the forensic anthropological research that was done in 2004, when they exhumed all the Medici bodies from the graves and did various diagnostic tests on the bones and so on. And that's where I read all these conditions that she had, and the other Medici members too. And I just thought that was just amazing, because my research, again, as you know, is very concerned with the cultural value of the arts for health and well-being. And my passion is thinking about how to get people to think about living well and being happy, and just something, how do you get people to just think what they could do to just make one little change, to, just be in the moment. I suppose it's that. So having all those illnesses, and already having researched a lot about her and what she might be like, and I had this sense that she was very vibrant and, very excited. And of course there was also the thing that she really was Spanish, but then she sort of became Italian. That was pretty challenging. But that then got me thinking about how I could put my passion into the way I wrote the piece, which was really about, in a more subtle way, trying to highlight things like, diet and nutrition, because fruit, it's not everybody's favourite, but, it is good for you, and drinking water, and just enjoying your life. And I thought, there she was, she had all those things. And I think anybody with a health condition, whatever it might be, sometimes it's really challenging. We've rehearsed every morning at 7 o'clock every morning in these baths this week. And the weather has been different every morning. We've had storms, we've had chilled to the bone and whatever. And I got sciatica in my hip.
Things we do for art.
Exactly,
Alison.
I know.
Suffering people, it's suffering.
And Chris got sciatica too, because it was so cold. But the thing is that all of you know that if you've got terrible pain, whatever the condition is, and pain takes you over. And I've had pain in the lumbago, in the lumbar region, so that was very heartfelt for me, because it's awful. It's all you're thinking about, the pain. So I just thought, well, how did she do that? And that was then my next sort of way forward, I suppose.
It's interesting, because that's one of the things that, in the accounts that we receive, it's clearly an enormous part of the consciousness, this notion about health and am I healthy, and are my family and my children okay, and
Yeah.
you know, how's my husband, and all that. And yet that never comes through in, if you like, in the historical narrative, or even in the pictorial one. You know, we don't see in the Bronzino pictures, we don't see, you know, people with tuberculosis. We see bold, handsome, attractive people staring back at us. And I thought that was a really interesting texture to bring to those lives. I was sort of minded. I remembered whilst you were going through the various processes of the bleedings and everything else, I was reminded of the fact, which is just an amusing factoid for the audience, that it wasn't until about 1910 that you were more likely to get better by going to visit a doctor than worse. So, I mean, and that seemed, and I thought again in the context of the baths, which were, you know, here for health-giving properties. You know, there was that notion that this would be good for you. Again, I thought that was really quite extraordinary. Here we are in a place where people would feel the opportunity for cure, and yet here we are with a tubercular cough and the very serious multiple ailments that one is living with, because the medical, you know, the doctors at the time simply had no real way of improving things for you.
No, I mean, that's absolutely right. And in thinking about, you know, I wanted to perform this here at the Roman Baths because I think it is the most special place. I think it's got a spiritual dimension that I personally connect with. I felt very at home in that space, and you know, the whole sacred. But you think about the Romans, I mean, they were, you know, very into their spas and using essential oils and aromatherapy and massage, all of which, you know, I'm 100% behind as a holistic health practitioner. And I use that sort of thing in my life all the time. And I think we've got into a culture where people run to the doctor very quickly and easily, perhaps, without just maybe stopping to think, actually, is there something I could do? And I think that culture now of a sort of a 10-minute appointment is totally impossible, because holistically it is about the whole person, and they're just the physical conditions, you know. And for me, what this site represents is mind, body, and spirit, because I don't think you can have one without the other. And that was what was lovely about researching about Sulis Minerva, who of course was Sulis, the Celtic god, who the Romans appropriated and became Sulis Minerva. And we did some fascinating research around the curses with the Roman Baths manager here, who got out 4 plastic boxes of curses not on display. And so that was quite an interesting dichotomy, really, because those curses, they're pretty awful. They're, you know, will you please boil them in blood because they took my bathing costume, or, you know, something to that effect.
Seems reasonable to me, but...
So, I don't know, this site... It's just fantastic. I mean, you summed it up at the beginning when you said when you came. I know the first time I ever came here, I just loved it. I don't know. It's sometimes you can't put a lot of words to it. It's just a connection, and you think this space is really special.
Well, as I'm always pointing out to some of my colleagues in academia, you know, the arts or art, it's not intellectual process by other means, and quite frequently, you know, you're left sometimes without words. Now, knowing this is a literature festival, we should probably talk a little bit about the text. Yeah. I guess before I ask you a bit about the writing and the writing process, there's a part of me that really thinks, and this, I guess, is me as a visual artist, but there's a part of me that sometimes sees text in these kinds of circumstances, not as a stream of coherent words, but as a kind of indication, as a sort of texture, if you like, as opposed to a text. And I did feel that much of the way through. The acoustics clearly in a situation like that means that I'm never going to hear all of it. I'm a bit deaf anyway. So, but that felt for me to be I didn't feel I was missing anything because I was getting this sense of texture as much as specifics. Do you want to talk a little bit about that at all? Because that's where, if you like, the performer meets the written word, and there's a dynamic there.
Well, I think that's great that you felt that, because I think it, again, sums up a desire, anyway, within the piece to be a bit fragmentary, because, you know, we never hear all the conversation. You know, we're always picking up bits of conversation and bits of gossip, or they say she had a cadaverous look, or whatever. When I was writing it, I have to say that I did loads of research in terms of trying to look at as much original material as possible. So I looked at a lot of letters, particularly of this Dr. Andrea Pasquale, who was a real doctor, and who wrote a lot of things about Eleonora, you know, and what they were doing and so on, to different courtiers or whatever. And so the basic, you know, I based a lot on what actual letters and things, for example. But I also, when I was writing it, right from the beginning, I was trying, because remember I had learned all that information about her body, health, etc. So I was trying to write it as though all the time I was, you know, either thinking, did you know, what was going on there at the time, and that's also why I think, as I was writing like that, when I came to start performing it, rehearsing and so on, I was trying to really get that idea that, you know, she was very volatile in a way, and that, you know, she was in one way very fragile with her health, but then in another she was terribly haughty at times and really thought she was the best. And, you know, also that kind of, you know, the Spanish background, because when she was 2, you know, she was learning these devotional texts that she had to do every day for what might be ahead of her and all of this. So the text, I'm not saying it is simple, but I was trying to be quite simple. I was trying to use the sense from those letters and information and keep it very focused, whilst obviously trying to give a narrative of her life.
And so when you're approaching, I guess, when you're approaching this notion of being both the writer of the text and the performer of it, as you're writing, are you imagining what this is going to be like to perform? Or are you going to worry about that later, or how does that happen?
I'm going to worry about it later. Yeah, no, I'm not really thinking about that. No, yeah. I just wanted to get the first draft of the text, you know, as something to work with. And it's interesting, I mean, we've made a few changes since we did it in the Cappella de Pazzi in the Basilica. I mean, they're small changes, but you know, the little bit where she's with the youngest children, a little bit of Spanish to those youngest children, because the whole thing has played more for me about this Spanish-Italian thing and what the Florentines, some of them, you know, a lot of them didn't bitchy, like it, yeah. Pretty awful. I think that the performing, I mean, obviously you've got some ideas, but it is the actual trying out of things and sort of then making changes to the text a bit as well, because the first draft was changed. Then I think they're sort of in the end feeding each other.
And I guess then turning to how you're approaching performance, I just note, and it's not by... whilst I know your work very well, Alison, I've never seen you perform before.
No.
It's just your text I know. You know,
yeah.
It's your books and your literary output that I know very well. But you know, it's impossible, and I'm sure everybody got this. It's impossible not to see the combination of details that have made up this character and have brought this 450-year-old woman to life for us. Everything from, you know, the book of hours that you're flicking through, you know, the earrings, the way that the costume makes a particular statement. it feels to me, and it might be different to this, but it does certainly feel to me as meticulously planned and investigated as the text might be.
Yeah, I hope so, because as some people will know, I did some research in Florence before we went to do the performance a couple of months before, and I was extremely privileged to be able to interview Florentine aristocracy, contemporary ones at the moment, and also really, people of a certain elite, I suppose you might call them. I don't know how I would quite describe them. And so this jewellery that I'm wearing is Angela Caputi, who I interviewed, who is an international jewellery designer. And she didn't speak English, and she had to have a translator. She invited me on a next trip to one of her workshops. She's got several in Florence and New York, all over the world. Not these ones, but the first ones I wear, which, match exactly the colour of the buttons. She made those for me in the workshop while I was there. I had to go with the costume. And then she gave me this jewellery. And very kindly said to me after the performance, you can keep it because I hope you do go and do it in another site. So that was very lovely. And when I was doing some research at the V&A in London, in the Renaissance galleries, I found that fascinating. If you've not been to the Renaissance galleries in the V&A, do go along, because it was brilliant for me, because the ceramics and the children's little christening bonnets and all this stuff. But when I was there, I went down, like you do after, you've been working away, you go in the shop or have a coffee or whatever. And there was her jewellery being sold, so that was quite amazing as well. But those...
So did you whip them off?
No. But, some of the other people that I interviewed were really extraordinary people. You're talking about the Princess Corsini, one of the oldest families, who refused to do the interview with me in English at the beginning, and said she would only do it in French. Luckily, I do speak French, but I didn't really want to do it in French, and I had to do everything to sort of charm her, to win her round, and it was jolly difficult. And at the last minute, I told her that I'd seen her on the internet, it wasn't YouTube, but somewhere where she was doing a fantastic English interview, and I won her, and so it was in English. And she, the stories, she brought her mother's shoes, which were these beautiful leather-crafted shoes, and they each came in a sort of a covered box, and told me stories about her mother and as a child, and created a completely different picture, as we often find when you meet someone. They're not at all like you think. A very moving story. And then in contrast to that, you have someone like Anna Lupi, who is a professor of anatomy at the Academy of Fine Arts, where I'm a visiting professor at the moment, and I'm very thrilled to be doing that. And she said to me, "Would you like to pop in for a coffee, Alison? I can get you in the back door, past, Michelangelo's David." Yeah. And I didn't
need to miss that, really.
Yeah, I didn't do that at all. But later I got to know her, and we just connected. And one evening we were just talking, and I said to her, I bet you live in the most fantastic place in Florence. And she said, "I live next to the church of San Lorenzo."
Oh, yeah.
I said, "Oh, well, that's fantastic. Fantastico." And she said, "Yes, Alison, when I open my bedroom window, I look down, and that is where Eleonora's remains are."
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Just next to the Lorenzo.
And she said, "I say good night, Eleonora, every night."
Oh, phew. Wow.
Now, you might not want to believe that, but it was, it depends. I'm somebody that I think sometimes who we meet there's a reason for it, and there were lots of things with that.
Yeah. I guess probably the other thing that is a bit inescapable, and yet it seems perfectly consistent with, again, if you if you know the Bronzino portrait and some of the other depictions of Eleonora, they are very they're very elegant, and in a certain way, it's a strange paradox. There's a sense of projection of self, but there's also a sense of self-possession. One of the interesting design components that I can't get around is the Vivienne Westwood thing. It's just impossible for me to ignore, and yet I see that that's a sort of a perfect corollary. I mean, that feels to me to be a perfect corollary. You're looking at, if you like, and it's not something as kind of basic as trying to bring it into the 21st century or something. It's much, much deeper than that. Do you want to tell us a bit about that, please?
Yes, well, in those research interviews that I've just mentioned in Florence in the March, there was one particular man. His name is Fausto Calderé. He's an international furniture scholar, and his specialism is the 16th century interior designs. And he was an incredible, incredible person to meet. And he brought with him, I just should explain probably, that I asked all my guests to bring me a personal fashion memento that was very important to them for whatever reason, and to have thought about how it might relate to Eleonora de Toledo. And he brought with him this hat that was a crown, very soft. It just looked like a crown. And he told me that he bought it when he was first sent by his father to London to work in, it wasn't Harrods, but wherever it was. And he found a shop in the King's Road, saw it and loved it. And it was Vivienne Westwood before she was known. And I said to him, well, where do you keep it? And he said, I keep it on one of my marble busts in the hallway. He then went on to become friends with Vivienne Westwood. And luckily, always do your research, Greg, before an interview. And luckily, I had seen that this Fausto, he's known as the most elegant dressed man in Italy, which is something.
That's really something.
Something.
Goodness me.
And I'd seen he had a collection of 100 cufflinks, and some of them being Vivienne Westwood. So I'd also seen that some of them were fairly risque. And in the green room before we went in, he actually said to me, oh, Alison, and he said, would you like to see something, And there his hand was this gold dildo cufflink. And he said, I thought you might like to see this. And I said, oh, yes, what else have you got?
Could be a dangerous question in those circumstances, to be honest.
It's only because I'd read up about, he had dolphins with rubies, Oswald Boating connection, various things there. So I've probably now lost the drift of what we're really talking about.
We're talking just about the Vivienne Westwood aesthetic,
if you
like. Yeah.
That's right. And there were other people. There was an architect who wore his Vivienne Westwood blazer jacket. And so it was clearly a link for a lot of people. And the costume designer, Tim Hayward, he and we talked a lot about, what sort of style in a contemporary way would capture, now, what would that be? And because of the research of those interviews and other things that came up, the Vivienne Westwood idea sort of came. And of course, also being that bit different. And he also introduced me to other designers whose work I didn't know, but that's obviously his specialism. And he introduced me to the idea of designs which were kind of asymmetric somehow, and that sort of we spent a lot of time talking about what that would be and how we could incorporate the original design of that dress that they found. And of course, I'm going to forget her name, which is appalling of me. Janet Arnold, worked on the 12-year project, and she made the patterns for that dress. So he actually, because you can actually get the pattern, and he took the pattern of Eleonora's dress, the funeral dress, and that was the starting point. And then on that, worked with the idea of Westwood, and then of course all those fabrics. We had a great time in Derby Market, looking through loads of fabrics and choosing. It was all very interesting, and that's sort of how it came about.
And it's a very different way of making that that connection to sumptuousness with elegance, and it's getting that balance right. It never verges on the vulgar, and it's
no.
Yes, even the gold dildo looks really on a cufflink looks fine. Well, at that point, we'll bring it to a close. Thank you so much for this evening. As you said before, this is a very special place. And I think for much of us, for our visit this evening, this has been substantially made substantially more special by our experience tonight. As you've described the importance of being in the moment, and I think we all got there. I was looking around at some really smiling faces of people thoroughly, utterly charmed by the presence of a 450-year-old woman explaining their lives to us. Please don't go without purchasing a copy of the said text, which is being held aloft behind us here, and Alison has graciously consented to sign those books for you on the way out the door. But I'd just finally like to say very, very big thanks to the Baths for hosting this event, and especially really to Alison and Chris White and Nick Sorensen, wherever he is, for giving us such an extraordinary performance this evening. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Greg. Thanks very much.